Good evening. I'm going to start, as we let a few stragglers come in, I'm going to start with some housekeeping, if you don't mind. First of all, our schedule has some new speakers on it. Let me share that with you. Next month, we're going to hear from 10,000 Villages, the store here in town, but it has an interesting connection with the Presbyterian Church and even some other churches, and they're going to come and talk about that. We don't have enough merchants come in to talk to us. We have a little trouble getting them to be comfortable speaking. They think that all they have to say takes 5 minutes, not a whole talk, so we're always glad when we can get one of the merchants to come in. In May, Dr. Beth Rourke, whom some of you have already heard, she's been here before. She's a professor at Chatham, and she was largely responsible for providing the pictures for our Squirrel Hill book. And Beth is going to talk about cemeteries. She's taught to us before about cemeteries, but she's continuing to do new work on it, and going to talk about Steel City cemeteries from graveyards to gardens. On June 1st, we will have our annual walking tour. And we're going to do Chatham again. There's some new gardens and stuff to see. We've done Chatham before. Beth Rourke will run the walking tour. That walking tour is $3 for members and $5 for non-members. Sign-up sheets are now out. We usually try to max it out about 25 people. It's a wonderful tour, first Saturday in June. Later in June, we will have the history of Temple Sinai. And just to tell you, we already have 2 speakers for the fall. Someone's going to talk to us about Walter Forward of Forward Avenue in September. And then we're going to have one of our Get to Know Your Neighbors talks. We do that occasionally from Oakmont in October. Some of you know that our schedule was changed tonight, that we have John Canning coming in, who's going to talk about department stores downtown. John has some medical problems he has to straighten out. We're hoping that maybe he can come later in the year. And we're also very thankful to tonight's speaker that she was willing to move up her talk a couple of months. The last thing I want to talk about is membership. I sometimes talk about membership. We're a membership organization. We don't have very high dues, and we don't have a particularly large set of, if any, extra membership activities, but we welcome the loyalty of our members, and I always like to say we're probably the only nonprofit group in town that has stayed in the black for 10 years, thanks to our members, and the fact that we don't really spend a great deal of money. But the fact is that the speaking system, the camera in the back, donations to Chatham and to the Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy have been made possible because we continue to have a budget. We have tended to have about 100 members each year for the last 3 or 4 years, and we've tended to have 90% renewal rates. This year, we're not going to have that. And why? Because people have moved out. I've just had a larger group than usual of folks who have not renewed, probably because many of them have moved away. So I'm just urging everyone in this room who used to be a member and hasn't renewed, any new people in here, to consider seriously paying our little $10 single, $15 couple membership fee so we can build this back up. Because, again, even though we're still in the black, I have to watch as we go forward to make sure we have enough money to do the things we want to do. So that's the housekeeping. Are there any questions before we move to our talk? Our speaker tonight is Maggie Jensen, who's the CEO of the Pittsburgh YWCA, who's come with a lot of history and a lot of discussion about what the Y does, which most of us don't know a great deal about. Maggie came to the YWCA 5.5 years ago after running the state of Arizona probation system, one of our more interesting backgrounds we've ever had. So without further ado, Maggie, and thank you for coming tonight rather than 2 months from now.
For me, will I turn on
lights dim?
I don't think so. I don't think so.
Okay. Up here usually works best for that.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank the members of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society for inviting me this evening. And also especially Evelyn Young, who is not only a member of the Historical Society, she has been a board member of the Y and a member for many years, so it's really appropriate, and thank you, Evelyn. I am always happy to talk about the YWCA. Most people, it seems, don't know that we're different than the YMCA. I've been introduced several times as the CEO of the YMCA, and people tell me all the time, oh, I work out at your facility. No. And yesterday, my assistant handed me this copy of the, let's see, what is it? It's the Pittsburgh City Paper, and it says, about tonight, the YWCA in Pittsburgh since 1869, Speaker Magdalene Jensen, CEO of the YMCA. So, can't shake that. But I'm hoping by the end of this evening that you'll have an appreciation for what we do in the context of where we've been. And before I get started, I'd like you to know that there's a lot of history, so really I'll just be giving you a thumbnail, sort of skeleton of what we've been doing the last 144 years here in Pittsburgh. At the Heinz History Center, there are 143 boxes of archived materials from our history, and so our predecessors have done a good job in preserving that. But again, I think I'll focus on decades and just sort of a snapshot of what it is we were doing. One other caveat, and that is some of the names of some of the committees from the past are politically incorrect, but I'm going to use the names tonight of those committees in their historic context. So to begin, I'd like to start with a quote that I found in a report that was done in 1954 to celebrate the 100 years of the YWCA internationally. It started in 1855 in England, because I think it sets for me the theme of what we've been here in Pittsburgh, and you can see it, but it says, one of the healthy signs of the pioneering activities of the YWCA has been not only to recognize a need and try to meet it, but also to know when needs and projects end or operate independently of its parent organization. And I hope that as we talk about this, that you'll agree with me that this does describe us. Now, as to how we started. During the Civil War, there was an evangelist, and his name was Dwight Moody. And he was a conscientious objector, and he went to the front lines 9 times. And because of his work, became an internationally known evangelist, and he traveled to England and other parts of the world. Because when he went on behalf of, to the front lines, he actually went on behalf of the YMCA. He was interested in the YMCA. But as I said, spent time in England. So here's the beginning of our records. During the dark days of the Civil War, a group of women in Allegheny used to meet to sew for needy families. Stimulated by the visit to Pittsburgh of Dwight L. Moody in 1866 and his account of the work being done by the Christian Women of London, this sewing group became the nucleus of the Women's Christian Association. The association was organized in 1867 under the leadership of Mrs. Felix Brunette of Allegheny. And in fact, if not in name, because they didn't have the young on that yet, this marked the beginning of the work of the YWCA in Pittsburgh. And if you noticed, I've discovered that we've been celebrating our anniversary incorrectly, because we've been saying it's 1869, when in fact we're older than that. It's actually 1867. Now, to put that in context, that's 2 years after the close of the Civil War. And according to the records, the women decided to provide assistance to suffering families of returned Union soldiers. They were suffering mainly from unemployment and illness, and they provided what they called personal service. So my guess is they actually worked with individual families, and they referred to this as relief work. To put it in context, at that time, there were no organized charities in Pittsburgh. Women's clubs were unknown. Social service agencies were not existent. Few women were age earners. Women could not vote, and I was surprised to find this. Women had little part in church life then. In 1875, here in Pittsburgh, was held the third International Conference of Women's and Young Women's Christian Associations. And here's a passage I found to describe it. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows of the Second Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh on October 3rd, 1875, as ladies in their bustles and bonnets gathered for the third International Women's and Young Women's Christian Associations. There were delegates from 28 cities, including the newest branch, the YWCA of the East End, which had been organized in 1875. And this marked the first time YWCA was used. But what's interesting is the term young women, according to the records, they were not describing who they served. They were describing themselves, and which is, I think, interesting because you also age out, at least I have, out of the young women part. Now, at that time, there was no centralizing force. However, according to the conference records, all of these associations worked toward a common goal, which was, quote, the temporal, moral, and religious welfare of young women who are dependent on their own exertions for support. So it seems that they're talking about single women who were trying to make it in society. And it wouldn't be until the turn of the century that we actually worked together collectively and formed a national organization. But something called the Panic of 1873 is what resulted in our very first organized program. Now, the Panic of 1873 resulted in something called the Long Depression because it was an international economic depression and it lasted till 1879. And the women of the YWCA noticed destitute girls, little girls and boys, and they wanted to do something to, quote, draw them off the street. So our first formal program in 1875 was an industrial school for girls held on Saturday afternoons. And then they also had one in the evening for little boys. And here's a picture of the industrial school on Saturdays. Now, interestingly, the industrial school for boys only lasted 4 years and was turned over to the YMCA, but the industrial school for girls ran 38 years until 1913. And what triggered the end of that was that home economics courses were introduced into the public school. And those are the kinds of things, apparently, that were being trained on those Saturdays. 1877, we hired our very first employee, Margaret Forsythe, for $25 a month. It indicated there was a lot of work to do in training and also relief work, so she became our first employee. Now, at the turn of the century, women, of course, and men were flocking to Pittsburgh because this was the Industrial Revolution. And, quote, working girls were often found to be living in undesirable quarters, often lonely and in need of training for positions for adequate wages. So 2 residences were purchased, one in 1891, and this was the Central YW, and they purchased a home and had rooms for rent at 421 Penn Avenue, but they also served lunches for employees and shoppers at Horns for 15 cents. Now, the Central YW actually incorporated in July 1892. And I've brought over on the table copies of our incorporation papers. You'll see some photos up on the wall. The first one is Mrs. O.H. Allerton. She was our first board president. And next to her is Mrs. William Thompson, the second one. And the third one over on the right is Lavera Brown. She became our first African-American board president. That didn't happen until 1978. But interestingly, the third board president was Sarah Pence, who actually died in office, I found. But what I found interesting about her is there is a list on the end of the table of all our board presidents. It needs to be updated, but it's all of our board presidents. If you ever come to our building on 4th and Wood, you can come to the 4th floor. Those are photographs. We have photographs of every board president since 1875. And it's kind of a sociological statement because married women did not use their first name until 1970s, which I find really amazing. They were Mrs. John Smith, or 1970s. I found that interesting.
They became Ms. in 1970.
That's right, and if you'll notice, we start using Ms. too. We don't tell you whether they're married anymore. Also, on the incorporation papers, you'll notice Louise Buell. She actually was the wife of Henry Buell, and he founded the Buell Foundation, if you're familiar with that, in Pittsburgh, in her memory. Now, in 1892, the East End YW purchased a residence at 219 Collins Avenue, and they were very proud of the fact that they could accommodate 30 girls, and they were really proud of their bathing facilities. It had a bathroom, had bathrooms, and they charged $4 a month. Now, oh, I forgot to show you. This is a photograph of one of the kitchens in one of the residences. And by the way, I brought copies of all of these pictures, and they're just on paper, so you can touch them and everything over on the table if you want to look at any of these later. Within these facilities, supportive services were developed, such as recreation, training, vocational classes, day nurseries for mothers, which was something new, and a kindergarten. In 1895, the Central YW moved to a larger location at 125th Street, formerly known as the Thaw Mansion, and it allowed the organization to add a gymnasium where members performed the latest, quote, scientific exercise programs. And here's one of them. Imagine fencing in bloomers. And so these two residences started what is a tradition that we still have today for residences for women. And today we have them for women with children as well. Around this time, YWCAs were beginning to develop all around the country, and they grew from local grassroots organizations. One actually was started in Lawrenceville in 1902, and it actually ran for 35 years. But 1906 turned out to be a watershed year. In a book I took a look at called The History and the Rise and Progress of Pittsburgh, written in 1906, it told us that YWCAs in Pittsburgh had 2,675 members at that time. But this was also the year that the National Board of the YWCA was actually created, joining YWs all around the country. And the Central YW and the East Liberty YW became charter members of the National Association. It states in the original charter, this closer, more defined organization made possible better leadership training and gave a vehicle for service for education and social action. Now, this was also the time of the suffrage movement. Women, of course, could not vote. And so, when we incorporated, and also when the National Association was created, it was created as a membership organization where women could vote. The idea was this was a place where women could exercise their vote and actually determine the future of the organization, the destiny of the organization. And since then, we've been regarded as a national organization, but you know, we really aren't. We're a national association because we pay dues. It doesn't come the other way. We are still, in many ways, grassroots organizations because each YW stands or falls or flourishes or not based on their own ability and the community support around it. So the beginnings still continue in that regard till today. Also, interestingly, in 1906, Henry Frick, one of the icons of Pittsburgh, made an offer to the YW. A building fund had been established to build a bigger place. And he said he would contribute $100,000 toward a building fund if the YW could raise $120,000, could match it with $120,000 the following year. He also said he would offer another $100,000 to start an endowment fund if another $100,000 could be raised within 2 years of completion of the building. And actually, these industrious women rose to the challenge. They not only raised the $220,000, they actually raised more than that and were able to build a new building and start an endowment fund. Once the National Board was created, the very first public action was in 1911 when a vote was taken in convention committing the YWCA to educate the public on the need for a living wage for women and the need to support legislation that would regulate hours and wages for women workers. Now, in the early years of the 20th century, a new focus came into play, and that is something called extension work. This is a photograph in 1909 of the Extension Committee. Now, extension work was reaching out to female factory workers in Pittsburgh. And they started with having prayer and song meetings during lunch, but very quickly it turned into organization of clubs. And they were self-governing clubs. One member of the club recorded, it was the first time I had seen no class distinctions in a club. They became the medium for training association leaders and for their work in the community. But this was an interesting time because it shifted some of the focus of our work from Christian charity to a focus on the welfare and rights of working women. And in a book I read about the subject, it actually led to some strife because some original members felt that charitable work should be the focus, not advocating for rights of factory workers and women in the workplace. We also, I want to talk about camping, because camping has been part of YW programming since 1911. First, we rented campsites, but in 1929, we purchased a campsite near Zelienople. You might actually see there's a woman looking up at the sign. Lost my place here. It was 105 acres known as Camp Karandawana. Girls of all races and religions were welcome, and programs, living arrangements, and counseling that were given to campers were based on an experience of, quote, democratic living. I found a series of pictures I wanted to share with you over the years. When I look closely at this, I see some waves in the hair. This might be the 30s. And the cars here seem to suggest, and the lovely outfits that might be the 30s. I don't know about this, I just thought it was a cool picture. This could be today even. That looks like the 40s at Camp Karandawana. And I think this is the 50s because the girls have curly spit curls, pin curls. I used to have them, I'll admit. And I think this is the 60s, as well as this one. I think this one also is the 60s. So I want to turn to University of Pittsburgh because we established a university branch as a club at the University of Pittsburgh in 1911. And according to the records at Pitt, the YWCA club helped to bring about the first cooperation between Catholics, Jews, and Protestants on campus. Quote, it gave girls of similar purpose and outlook the opportunity to think through their religious problems, define their social responsibilities, and work together to make their ideals effective in their own lives and relationships. Those of you who are familiar with the Cathedral of Learning can see this is right in front. And this looks to be about, I would say, the late 1940s, maybe early 1950s. Now, Jean Hamilton Walls was the first African-American woman to receive a bachelor's degree from the university in 1910, University of Pittsburgh. And while at Pitt, she joined the YWCA, the campus YWCA. At that time, it was the only campus organization open to African-American women. This is Jean right here. She later became the executive director of the Center Avenue branch of the YWCA a number of years later. Now that takes me, I would like to now turn to World War I. During World War I, YWs around the nation focused on strengthening the home front. YW members cooperated with the National War Council. The National War Council asked us to work on 4 things. First, a hostess house for service for the wives and friends of servicemen. They asked us to work among Negro women and girls, foreign-speaking women, and industrial girls. And here's another quote. Although Negroes had been mentioned throughout the years in the work of the Pittsburgh YWCA, the influx of Negro war workers from the South brought about the need for decent quarters and an educational and cultural program. And so we established something called the Committee on Colored Work. Remember what I said about words being politically incorrect these days. The committee worked to establish savings programs, improve housing and job opportunities for African Americans, factory workers who flooded Pittsburgh. So a YWCA was created in the Hill District, and a residence was secured in 1920. One of the things that is on the table is an article from the Pittsburgh Courier in September of 1955. And a Dr. Sadie Hamilton, who was 97 years old at the time, was interviewed. And it's really a piece of our history because she recalls how the field secretary of colored work from the YWCA came to Pittsburgh and worked with our committee to establish a YWCA on the Hill. And she tells us that they found a house at 2215 Wiley Avenue. This is the predecessor of what would become the Center Avenue YW. It was feeling that at the time that it would meet the needs of women during World War I. And she said they, quote, scrubbed and cleaned it out, and on April 1st, 1919, hung out the YWCA sign. She stated that she was unanimously elected as the manager and was elected every year until Jean Hamilton Walls, that was actually her daughter that I referred to at the University of Pittsburgh, became the executive director. And in the article it said, Jean Hamilton Walls said, I insisted on Mother resigning because I thought it was too much Hamilton. Now, I found a few pictures. This looks like about the 40s, I think, probably at our Center Avenue branch. And I think this is the 50s, and I'm judging that from the clothing and particularly the hats. Now, these copies of all of this are over there, but these are two articles about the woman at the top. Her name is Peggy Hicks, and she was being honored at a tea, and these are the two ladies that organized the tea. Now, back to World War I, because this happened during World War I. This is interesting that this happened during World War I. The YWs have been working with industrial girls since the turn of the century, but because there were so many women coming to work in the war plants in such great numbers, that we began to create recreation centers and clubs located near factories. The Industrial Service Center was located on the north side in 1919, and a second one followed the following year. I brought with me some posters from World War I. So if you'll notice on the far right, with the young woman holding the bomb, that is an authentic World War I. I hope you'll take a look at them afterwards poster. And there's one right in front, which says, back our girls over there, United War Work Campaign. And my favorite up on the table is, remember the girl behind the man behind the gun. We actually found these in a closet, and they were in really terrible frames, so we had them framed so that we could preserve them. Now, after World War I, we took an interest in something called business girls. And there was a concern about the needs of business girls. Now, they were defined as white-collar working girls. They became the focus with residences, educational classes, physical education, and protective working laws. And by the way, oh, this was something from the Hill District also. This is a photograph of some of our members from 1919 when the planning for the business girls took place. But by 1930, we actually had a department for business girls. And gradually, business classes in shorthand, typing, and the like were created. This is actually a copy of an invitation, the third birthday jubilee of the YWCA Business Girls Lounge, and this is 1946. So we actually did this for quite a long time, right after the First World War and past the Second World War. Now, according to our records, gradually the need for these classes disappeared because public schools started teaching typing and shorthand. So here's an example of something we created and then had an end because it was taken over elsewhere. This is a little flyer I found, which I thought was interesting. Meet your fellow members. It's not housewives, it's home women. Business and professional women, industrial women, farm women, students, and others. Now, I found a canvas for funds for 1923, and it's actually on the side too, and it has some interesting figures from 1922. In 1922, there were boarding accommodations for 110 girls, but the average every month in transient girls were 97. 460 girls enrolled in high school clubs, 44 in industrial clubs. However, they report that they had contact with girls in factories of up to 100 a week, and there were 250 enrolled in classes in the gymnasium. The revenues that the YWCA had at that time were from rent, meals, class fees, and membership dues, and it totaled over $88,000. So 1922, we were a pretty going concern here in Pittsburgh. Now, the records show a number of mergers of various YWCAs because they were all over the city, it seemed, for a while. And I didn't think that was too interesting to talk about. The first one was in 1924, and the East End and the Central YW became the Metropolitan YW. And there's a whole lot of them. But one thing I did find, because I thought it was interesting, is an article from the Gazette in 1963, and it's about the Wilkinsburg YWCA, and the title is "Help Save Our Independent YWCA." This was an argument not to merge, because there was a proposal to merge, and I thought it might be interesting for you to take a look at, because they're talking about the dire consequences if we give up our own YWCA and merge with Central. The end of the story is eventually they did merge, but I thought it was an interesting article you might be able to be interested in taking a look at. Now I want to talk about something called the International Institute. If you remember, the National War Office asked us to work with female immigrants. And the last poster that I have here is actually about this. And I just wanted to lift it. This says, United for Women, YWCA, Division of Foreign-Born Women. And this is from 1918, so the last year of World War I. In Pittsburgh, in 1917, this focus on the expanding steel industry and the incredible number of immigrants and the need for services for these immigrants led to something called the International Institute at the YWCA. And it was organized to serve immigrant women. They provided clubs, casework, counseling services, and I did uncover a brochure. I know you can't read it, but it is on the side, talking about the things that they do. And as an example, I just wanted to show you that this is 1938. One thing is the sound of a huge teapot. The second one talks about a play that was going on with the assistance of the International Institute, an Easter egg designs show at the Institute. Members of the Interracial Youth Cabinet were guests of the International Institute. And finally, Dr. Frank Kai Ming Su was to address the YW regarding what is happening in China. Now there's a document, a booklet over there on the table from the International Institute called, let me find it, Review and Preview. And there's articles in it about attitudes toward new Americans in public assistance. And it talks about the fact that there has been some interest in what they called aliens that has been acrimonious and prejudicial to the interest of aliens. They talked about the Emergency Appropriation Act, which became a law in June of 1937, which removed all aliens from the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. Sounds familiar. It's the thing about if you're not a citizen, you shouldn't be working kind of a thing. Apparently, if you had your first papers, meaning if you took steps to become a citizen, you could continue to work in the WPA. But other than that, you couldn't. And they say it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that there is considerable public resentment of the alien who has omitted to take the legal steps necessary to obtain the privileges and of becoming a citizen. I also noted, I wanted to share this with you. This is undesirable aliens. We've been hearing a great deal about undesirable aliens, says Collier's magazine. Now we know just what an undesirable alien is. We get it from Miss Emma Cospel of Birmingham, Alabama, and she got it from her employer, a lawyer. What exactly, asked she, is an undesirable alien? Said her employer, an undesirable alien is a foreigner who makes more money than I do. And finally in the document is, this is really indicative of what was going on. They have a House Council, and the House Council is composed of 2 representatives from each of the groups that met at the International Institute, and here they are. The Athena Club, the Cosmo Club, the Czechoslovak Junior Circle, Hungaria Girls Club, International Women's Club, Italian Coeducational Club, Les Foyers Français, Lithuanian Intercollegiate Fraternity, Polish Women's Club, Samovar Club, Tasados Club, Ukrainian University Club, and the Chinese Institute of Pittsburgh. Now, the International Institute remained working until 1940, when it was taken over by the American Service Institute. So here's another example of something that was created here in Pittsburgh and morphed into something else and actually continues to this day. Okay. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the Depression years. What our records say is with the tragic 30s came many efforts to meet the needs of unemployed girls and women. They needed more than food and shelter, but the residents took them in, even when the girls could not make payments, or took them in when wandering from town to town looking for work. They were offered free courses in typing and shorthand, and interestingly, recreational activities to fill leisure time. Apparently there was a lot of leisure time when nobody could find a job. And domestic services were taught in the hope of raising standards for better employment. The Depression taxed the resources of the YW as well as other local charities because of reductions. Nobody had any money to donate, so because of reductions from public and private donations. But during this period of economic stagnation, it repeatedly talked about unemployed women wandering the country looking for work. And these short-term transient women needed a place to stay. So those residences were really kept busy during the Depression. This is a picture of an unemployment conference that was held in Pittsburgh. And the woman depicted is Miss Mary B. Anderson of the Women's Bureau of the United States Department of Labor. And she told of the inequities facing women in the industrial world. And we believe this is the planning committee of the unemployment conference. Now, during World War II, the focus of the YWCA shifted to meeting emergencies. Here,
Can I ask one question?
yes.
Was there a lobbying presence ever for the YWCA in Washington through all of this?
Was there a lobbying presence? Did we lobby?
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you that today we advocate. We don't have a lobbyist, but we do advocate. Last June I was at our national convention and we were trying to get Congress to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, and we've been working on that for 2 years because a lot of women's shelters are funded that way. It just actually passed last week. I think it was last week. But we don't have lobbyists, but we do some advocacy when we find it necessary. Okay, so during World War II, here's what we did. We became a cooperating unit of the USO, so we held USO activities. We held parties for shift workers regularly. Canteens were created for teenagers, and what's interesting is it describes in downtown and in industrial areas enormous crowds of women working during World War II. And everybody brought their lunch because of rationing. The food was so expensive and they had no place to eat their lunch. And so lounges were set up near industry by the YW at that time to try to assist the women working during the war. We also provided newcomers guidance on subjects such as correct clothing for factories and working habits. In 1943, we joined the community chest. Now, I just thought that was interesting because I think of Monopoly when I hear about the community chest. But what I discovered is the community chest was a capital campaign. Basically, it raised money from organizations and then distributed it to community projects who were members. This was eventually to become the United Way. And we actually do get some funding today from the United Way. Now, just as in World War I, we made a major shift, and that was with the International Institute. It's interesting that during World War II, we also made a very major shift. Now, given our roots, we have always maintained a focus on civil rights. And I can tell you that in 1875, at that third international conference here in Pittsburgh, it was recorded that, quote, the program showed inclusiveness of all, regardless of race, economic status, of nationality, or creed. However, in some areas of the country, including Pittsburgh, YWs were segregated. And so in the mid-40s, the National Association took up the very controversial issue of complete integration across the nation. And at a national convention that actually that was fraught with contention, the YWCA integrated by policy in 1946. Now, the records show it was a unanimous vote, but I read a book about it that said that that's because all of the protesting associations, many from the South and some others, walked out before the vote. But in Pittsburgh, our records show that this association committed to written policy that it is an interracial association with membership of all races and leadership and clientele 1 year before, in 1945. We actually adopted this on June 21st, 1945, and I brought a copy of our interracial policy for display. We have a photograph from around this time. You can see it's Eleanor Roosevelt. The woman in the middle is the national director from New York. And the woman on the left is a member of one of the YWCAs here in Pittsburgh, but she is unidentified by name. I found this other one, which I think is also from around this time, but I'm only doing it based on clothing. Now, I have something also sitting on the table, which I think is really valuable document because it captures a moment in this time. It is a thesis for the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh by 3 women in 1947, and it is called Methods of Developing Interracial and Intercultural Practices in the Pittsburgh YWCA, a descriptive study of 3 departments. And the 3 departments are the Y-Team department, lounges for employed girls, and the residences. What's interesting about that thesis is that it's not very analytical, but it is very poignant because it talks about, the Y teams standing on different sides of the room and staring at each other. And I think it's a really valuable piece, so I brought that that you can thumb through today. Now, most of us know that after the war, the government encouraged women to go home and get out of the workplace. So it's probably not surprising that in the 50s, when the men were returning from war and the women were encouraged to stay home, the fastest growing program at the YW in Pittsburgh was YW Wives. It provided a varied program of recreational and educational activities to provide a welcome break from household activities. Most popular was Ladies' Day Out, with weekly programs with preschool care while mothers took courses or took a swim or took a day trip or swam in the pool. And I read, quote, "This break in home duties is vitally important to the emotional health of the entire family." And here's one of those trips, I think, from the 1950s. Now, we have worked with teenagers from early on. And we worked with Campfire Girls in the late 1910s. And later they became known as Girl Reserves in the 1920s and 30s. And eventually, the clubs at schools and in community churches and centers were known as Y-Teens. Oh, I forgot this. This is a picture of, this is Pittsburgh, this is our cake, in 1955. And this was the centennial of the entire organization. But this is a picture of the Tri-State Y-Teen Conference in 1964 at Chatham College. And the other thing that I found was this little article about Y-Teens, and I thought it was interesting, from 1968. And what this is about is, it says the Y-Teens realized to some, and I think they're talking about their parents, the foxtrot was the only dance in town, and they preferred the monkey, and I have to confess, I do remember that. Hey, hey, we're the monkeys, remember that? And so they said their parents were square, so they were holding a party for their parents, and they were doing a square dance, having them perform in a square dance. Now that takes me to a major change for us, and that is at the end of the 50s, we completed an intensive self-study. It's about 100 pages. And of course, now this is after integration and taking a look at all of the YWs in the city. And it called for a centrally located building that would provide access for all members. And no longer would there be branches. They envisioned a new geographic structure, north, south, east, and west, with advisory councils. And so members began a capital campaign to raise the money to build a central downtown building. And it was completed in 1962 on Wood Street, between 3rd and 4th. It functions as our headquarters today. And in that first article that I mentioned about from Dr. Hamilton, Dr. Sadie Hamilton, the 97-year-old lady, she said something that I thought are the words from that time. And she talked about one association. The YW, this is 1955, the YW's new program and emphasis to become one, all caps, association in Pittsburgh, regardless of race, color, creed, age, and economic status. All branches have been eliminated. The community no longer has the Center Avenue branch, which was generally known as the colored branch. Neither does the city have any other branches. The YWCA now has 4 areas known as East, West, North, and South. Some of us, it's difficult to think of our branch as an activity center, but basically she said, we know this is the important way to go. So the struggle was, let's become one association, and we were going to be an activity branch. Now, it was probably in the late 50s and early 60s that our work really began in earnest on civil rights, expanding from just the gender definition, beyond for all. This is some of our women at the March in Washington in 1963. And at the National Convention in 1970, the association adopted what has become known as our One Imperative, to thrust our collective power toward the elimination of racism wherever it exists by any means. So up here, it's there, and there. This led to the redesign of our logo. And it is why now you see on our logo, eliminating racism, empowering women. When I think about it, I think that it is a symbol of organizational change, something we're still working on. We've been working here in Pittsburgh now, I didn't realize it till a few days ago, not 144 years, but 146 years on empowering women. And we've been working on the eliminating racism part 69 years. But from the 1970s until today, the YWCA would maintain its focus as originally espoused in 1906 in its charter as a vehicle for education, social action. Some of the more notable issues along the way since then are Vietnam, integration and segregation, advocacy for the Equal Rights Amendment. I have a few pictures of that. This is actually in front of our building downtown. And here's another, in a couple more in Market Square, arguing for passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which of course did not pass. Abortion and AIDS. Some of the more recent issues that we've worked on are voter education and registration to vote, and as I mentioned before, most recently the Violence Against Women Act. So, as I read our records, I see a pattern of leadership for YWCA Pittsburgh women, constantly assessing changing needs, showing flexibility in modifying or retooling services to meet those needs, and always innovation. In short, creative innovation to meet the changing needs of women and girls in all walks of life. So back to the original quote, one of the healthy signs of the pioneering activities of the YWCA has been not only to recognize a need, a lot of new needs over time, but to try and meet it and to know when those needs and projects end or operate independently of its parent organization. Here are a few significant movements that spun off from the YWCA here in Pittsburgh. The first is the National Travelers Aid Association. I didn't know until I read the records that it was piloted in a few YWCAs around the country in 1894, and the original point of the National Travelers Aid Association was a project to protect women who were traveling alone to cities. Other things that have spun off are day nurseries, the International Migration Service, the American Federation of International Institutes, the National Federation of Business, and professional women's clubs. Now, today, we operate 11 programs, and we handed out to you, I think as you came in the door, a short description of them. And you have them, so I'm not going to belabor it, but basically we do run today 4 housing programs. One is a transitional housing program. You have 2 years to get on your feet for homeless women and women with children. Women in supported housing are for women who have a dual diagnosis of mental illness sometime in their past, as well as substance abuse sometime in their past. Chrysalis Care Shelter is permanent housing for women with disabilities, a very broad definition. It could be mental illness, it could be former substance abuse, it could be a criminal history, anything that makes it difficult to find housing. And YW Homes, in the 1999, there was a decision in the federal court called the Sanders decision that found there was discrimination in housing in parts of Allegheny County. Out of that came the Sanders decree and some funding to purchase facilities. The YWCA did leverage that. We own 10 houses in nice neighborhoods with transportation, and we rent them to low-income single parents and families. Our youth programs are Tech Girls. There's a little bit of the information there, but that's a fabulous program. It focuses on math and science grades. And these are for underserved girls, and they've been making fabulous progress. We also have a STEM program for younger kids, and you'll see a variety of child care services. Our Center for Race and Gender Equity is our advocacy arm today, and that is where we work on whatever legal advocacy we have. I think we have one of the best trainers, diversity trainers in Pittsburgh. She comes to us with 7 years of working for the Anti-Defamation League, and does a fabulous job and can do consulting. We have a health equity program, the Women's Resource Center. We get calls all the time for help, and we try to match women in need and their children with our programs, and if we don't, we will find someone who can help. And finally, Hope for All is a program that assists in filing taxes and in hooking up with government services for which folks might not know that they are eligible. We have 4 annual events: the Stand Against Racism, that occurs at the end of April. Tribute to Women Leadership Luncheon, that's going to occur May 30th. You're all invited. There's usually 700 to 900 women in attendance, and it's a lot of fun. I left a card with the date. Week Without Violence in October, and the Racial Justice Awards every November. So I would say that at the YWCA today, in the tradition of those who've gone before us, we seek to create a stronger community for everyone through a movement of all women to seek equality, self-sufficiency, and education. We have been most fortunate that when the women of the YWCA began to lead by establishing new and innovative programs, the community of Pittsburgh, both men and women, have always stepped up and provided support. So while the times and clothes have changed since 1867, I'd say that the women of the YW are not so different than those women who founded our organization 146 years ago. They're all working toward inclusion in civil rights for everyone and to make a positive impact on our community in Pittsburgh. I am honored to be associated with the work of those who came before us. And I really think that we owe a lot to our predecessors, our ancestors. And I would also add that I'm very proud to be associated with the work of our staff that they're doing on a day-to-day basis today.
Questions are welcome as usual. I'll let you take them directly now.
Any questions?
1920 is when women got the right to vote.
Yes, that's correct.
Did YWCA ever do anything to bring that about?
Yes, once we incorporated and became a membership organization, we were active in the suffrage movement and advocating for the vote for women. Yes, yes. In fact, we had Gloria Steinem come and speak in 2010, I think it was. And she said that, you know, the YWCA is one of the very few organizations still operating today that was founded during the suffrage movement. So, yes, we had a lot of suffragettes at the YW.
And did you do any work with the right to vote movement?
Yes, we did. We did. A lot. It was the main concern about civil rights at the time because women didn't have the right, you know, to vote at the time. And we were also very active in the 1970s with the right for women to have credit. And so the answer is yes, that suffrage was one of the the very first civil right that we focused on. And in the back.
I think there's an interesting challenge now facing our organization. I like to think that we all belong, and that is that there are more women soldiers than there have ever been before, I believe, in the history of our country, and some of them have died in service to our country. At the same time that we have now what is the correct wording? Action Against Women, Violence Against Women.
Violence Against Women Act.
Yes, and now we have that challenge as well addressing us. Now it's been codified as legislation. I think it will be very interesting to watch the reaction of our organization to this group of women who has joined our armed forces, has seen it as an economic opportunity in some cases, and now they're coming home.
It'll be interesting, too, to see how it plays out because the Secretary of Defense, just passed, enabled women to be in all functions. And as I understand it, it'll be based on skill and ability. So it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out. That will enable women who are promoted within the military not to be considered as affirmative action. I mean, the definition of not being able to be in combat always handicapped them because they could never obtain the same experience and that the men had. So it'll take a long time, I think. The other area where I think it's really critical is more women in politics. It's about 17%, and before the last election, there were hearings on the Hill about access to reproductive rights, and there were no women at the table. It was all men, which seems sort of crazy. So I'm reminded of the quote that said, Allison Schwartz, I think, is the only female representative in Washington, D.C. from Pennsylvania. And I heard her speak, and she said her mother used to say, if you're not at the table, you may find yourself on the menu. And I think that one of the things that's really critical is for our voices to be heard, and we have to run for office to do that. Any other? Yes?
I know when the organization was founded, the C for Christian was
Yes.
obvious, but now it's...
Today, we're non-denominational, and it really, so we describe ourselves as having Christian roots, but it is non-denominational. In fact, our president, not now, but the 2 years before, was Jewish. So these days, it's not something that that is active in terms of religious proselytizing, but it's open to everyone.
By the way, is the YMCA the same way now?
Pretty much, I think. We actually have a joint project with them, that new one, the last program that is on the list, Hope for All, is in partnership with them. So we're actually working on that with them. They primarily focus on after-school programming and exercising. They do have, some other programs, but we're all about social services, pretty much. 11 social service programs. They have a few, but they're all about exercising, which is a good thing, and after-school programs, which is also a critically good thing. They have them all over the city, which is terrific. And we are working these days very closely together, but they are totally separate organizations with different histories, despite the fact that everybody kind of rolls at YMCA instead of the W. Yes?
Maggie, last century, a man friend of ours said that there's a whole misnomer. We're not all young, we're not all women,
Yes.
we're not all Christians. The only thing we have together is we're an association.
Well, I think there's a lot of truth to that. But I think, too, that at some point when, sort of the isms that we have in society come from those who don't feel they have access. I have the feeling, and I've been considered a feminist. I don't see myself that way. I see myself as a humanist. It's really, everything should be based on skill and ability, and there should be opportunity. So I think that, if we ever reach that point, then maybe we can take the women out of the name. Anything else? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Maggie. Good night. Please come to the next meeting. Please join us. Please sign up for the walking tour. And on Maggie's talk, I feel like we've gone through a history of America the last hour. And a wonderful one. Thanks.